Good evening, I'm Evan Gorlick, and this is the evening from the New York Times for Thursday, July 30th, 2026. We begin tonight with the economy, where the war with Iran has kicked up prices and disrupted global supply chains, and it shows in the latest numbers. Gross domestic product expanded at just 1.5% this past quarter, falling short of the previous quarter's 2.1%. Growth in both personal income and consumer spending also slowed in June. The war is hitting consumers directly in the form of high energy prices, which have made other goods more expensive. Oil prices have receded from their peaks in the spring, but damage in the form of higher prices for gasoline and other petroleum-based products is still hitting households and businesses. As tankers start sailing again through the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices have fallen nearly to their level before fighting blocked off the Persian Gulf 4 months ago. But as usual for a so-called supply shock, prices at the pump aren't falling as quickly. Gasoline retailers are taking the opportunity to recoup some of the profits they lost as prices rose. President Trump isn't having it, berating retailers on social media to drop their prices for what he calls our great American people. The Federal Reserve, which typically tames inflation by raising interest rates, yesterday decided to hold them steady. The market swiftly rejected that approach by the Fed's new chairman, Kevin Warsh, who has balked at raising rates despite pressure from other Fed leaders. After the decision, long-term government borrowing costs hit a 2-decade high. The 30-year Treasury yield rose 0.11 percentage points to 5.22% on Wednesday, its largest one-day increase in more than a year and its highest level since 2007. The 10-year Treasury yield, arguably the most important benchmark for borrowing costs across the economy, also surged. This suggests investors doubt whether Warsh will keep inflation contained. The bond market is falling again after the Fed's decision to hold rates steady, but the real story is the insistence by Warsh on letting markets run their course, a vision he telegraphed before getting the job. He also said he wanted a quieter central bank, but for now, there is plenty of short-term noise. Still, this morning's report showed that business investment, especially related to the AI boom, remained strong. Amazon joined a procession of tech giants that ramped up spending on AI, as the company's capital expenditures soared 69% to $53 billion in the second quarter as it built AI data centers and other infrastructure. It joined a parade of other big tech companies, with Meta reporting similar surges. Apple's profit increased 27% to $29.8 billion, blowing past Wall Street's expectations, though the company recently raised prices on a number of products because of component supply shortages caused by the artificial intelligence boom. After 15 years leading Apple to become a money-making behemoth worth nearly $5 trillion, Tim Cook bid adieu to Wall Street on Thursday, saying he truly has never been more optimistic about the company's bright future. An important measure of inflation also eased last month amid a temporary lull in the war. The Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation eased in June amid a temporary truce in the war with Iran. Overall consumer prices fell 0.1% in June and were up 3.7% from a year earlier, a slower annual pace than the 3-year high notched in May when the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index rose 4.1%. Core prices, which exclude volatile food and energy, also moderated. But renewed fighting across the Middle East means the reprieve may not last. In other economic news, the Trump administration exempted natural diamonds from his latest batch of tariffs after a Belgian group gifted President Trump a gold ring encrusted with 321 diamonds. The newly issued exemption followed negotiations with European officials last year and months of sustained advocacy by a diamond group in Antwerp, which dominates the global industry. The Antwerp World Diamond Center, which had once before secured a similar carve-out, presented the remarkable gift designed personally for Mr. Trump just weeks earlier. Turning now to the Justice Department, where President Trump said he might temporarily withdraw his nomination of Todd Blanche as Attorney General. The nomination was put on hold yesterday after 2 Republican senators threatened to block his confirmation over a tax immunity deal he cut to settle Trump's lawsuit against the IRS. Trump suggested he would rather withdraw Blanche's name than scrap or revise the lucrative deal, which could save the president and his family some $100 million. Law and precedent allow Blanche to continue serving in an acting capacity even if he cannot get confirmed. The threat followed a day of fruitless negotiations with 2 Republican holdouts, Senators John Cornyn of Texas and Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who are not returning to Congress next year. Blanche's quest to win Senate confirmation now hinges on the extraordinary protection from the Internal Revenue Service he granted President Trump. That immunity was part of a deal orchestrated by the Justice Department to end the president's lawsuit against the IRS. The other part of that deal, a $1.8 billion fund aimed at paying political allies of Mr. Trump, set off a political firestorm on Capitol Hill, and Mr. Blanche has since said that the so-called anti-weaponization fund is dead. But the audit immunity remains the central issue. In other administration news, the Justice Department moved to deport the mother of a convicted ISIS supporter, in a first test of an obscure, secretive court. An obscure court set up 30 years ago to expel immigrants accused of terrorism from the country heard its first case on Thursday, as the Justice Department asked a federal judge to deport an Afghan woman who prosecutors say supports the Islamic State. The request took place at a nearly hour-long hearing in Washington before what is known as the Alien Terrorist Removal Court, where much of the evidence is presented in secret and defendants cannot challenge how it was collected. During the hearing, prosecutors presented their initial claims that the woman, Najira Haji Zada, should be removed from the United States even though she is a lawful permanent resident. The Senate's Education Committee approved a bipartisan bill that would prevent the Trump administration from gutting the Education Department. The Trump administration's bid to dismantle the Education Department was rebuked on Thursday by the Senate Education Committee, which approved a bipartisan bill that would block the executive branch from gutting the agency. The legislation faces a long road to becoming law. Competing legislation in the House would instead codify many of the administration's actions, and President Trump is unlikely to sign into law a measure that directly undermines his policy agenda. Still, the vote was the sharpest opposition lawmakers had registered over the administration's attempt to eliminate the department. After claiming bias at the Smithsonian, the Trump administration has decided to stage its own museum exhibition featuring 68 American flags and AI-generated images of the Founding Fathers. ABC accused the Trump administration of punishing the network because the administration dislikes the content and viewpoints expressed on programs. The network's comments, made in a filing to the agency, are part of its formal opposition to the FCC's review of ABC's local broadcast licenses, an extraordinary escalation, ABC called it unprecedented, by the Trump administration in its efforts to bring media organizations to heel. In the lengthy filing, ABC called the FCC review an attempt to retaliate against the company because the agency dislikes the content and viewpoints expressed on the network's programs. Now to the widening conflict in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia said it was forming a new military coalition with over a dozen countries, including Egypt and Turkey, to protect boats transiting the Red Sea. Vessels in the waterway, often loaded with oil, have been targeted this past week by the Houthis, an Iranian-backed militia in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is forming a military coalition to protect shipping in the Red Sea as attacks by a Yemeni militia imperil a crucial route for Saudi oil exports and further threaten the global economy, according to the Saudi Defense Ministry. The kingdom has invited around 50 countries to join the new maritime coalition, which would be Saudi-led, and is pushing for them to commit as soon as possible. 2 ships in Egypt were also targeted yesterday when an unidentified drone exploded near the Suez Canal, another vital artery for global shipping. 2 ships, one of them a US-owned natural gas storage tanker, caught fire after an explosion at an Egyptian port on Wednesday, broadening the conflict in the Middle East. 3 marine tracking companies reported the incident. One said the explosion, in the Egyptian Mediterranean port of Damietta, had been caused by a drone attack, though there was no official confirmation from Egyptian authorities or the ship's owners. 2 Iranians said the explosion was designed to warn of further escalation. The attack isn't likely to affect global energy markets as much as those elsewhere in the Middle East because Egypt is not a major energy transit choke point in the same way. And on the home front, U.S. investigators believe Iran was probably behind a cyber attack on dozens of municipal water systems in Minnesota this week. Investigators believe a cyber attack this week on dozens of municipal water systems in Minnesota was probably the work of Iranian hackers, according to U.S. and state officials and others familiar with the matter, a potential act of aggression that comes at a precarious moment in the U.S. war against Iran. Officials cautioned that they had not definitively determined who was responsible for the attack and that the preliminary assessment could change. There were no indications that any water supply had been rendered unsafe to drink. Across the Atlantic, a European megafire has spread to Greece. On the Mediterranean island of Crete today, nearly 100 miles off mainland Greece, hundreds of firefighters battled a wildfire that has already killed 2 firefighters and forced thousands of people to flee. More than 220 firefighters were tackling the wildfire in Crete, which broke out on Wednesday in the area of Kraiovrysi, in the south of the island. The fire, one of several that the Greek authorities were trying to contain on Thursday, was being fueled by strong wind, complicating efforts to put out the flames. Greece also worked to contain fires on Lesbos and in the Peloponnese, where another firefighter has died. The wildfire season in Europe has been brutal. Across Spain and France, the fires have been the country's largest on record. Another fire this week in eastern England has engulfed almost 250 acres of scenic heathland just a few miles from a nuclear power plant. Dozens of people were evacuated from homes and vacation parks in eastern England on Thursday as fire crews tackled a wildfire around 4 miles from a nuclear power plant. The blaze began on Wednesday afternoon and engulfed almost 250 acres of land at Dunwich Heath in Suffolk, a scenic area of protected heathland on England's eastern coast. Emergency responders declared it a major incident, which in Britain means an event with serious consequences that require extraordinary measures by one or more agencies. The local fire service said that there was no current risk to the nearby nuclear plant. In more top news, Ukraine authorities said that Russian strikes on cities across the country killed at least 8 people. Russia pounded Ukrainian cities overnight with a barrage of missiles and drones that killed at least 8 people and wounded dozens of others, Ukrainian officials said on Thursday. The attack was the latest in a summer campaign of large-scale aerial assaults as Moscow apparently seeks to capitalize on Ukraine's dwindling air defenses. The overnight attack pushed Russia's use of ballistic missiles to a new monthly record. Russia has fired 126 ballistic missiles at Ukraine so far in July, surpassing the previous record of 118 set in February. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine said 5 members of a family had been killed in the latest large-scale aerial assault by Moscow. NATO said that a missile crashed in Poland during the attack. A Russian missile crashed in Poland on Thursday during an overnight assault on neighboring Ukraine, NATO said, an event that could risk bringing Russia closer to direct confrontation with the Western military alliance, to which Poland belongs. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, said the incident was a violation of Poland's airspace by a Russian missile and vowed to strengthen alliance defenses. This incident is yet another reckless act by Russia and a dangerous consequence of its war against Ukraine, he said. Health hospitals are seeing more uninsured patients in emergency rooms and clinics, citing cuts to Obamacare. More and more uninsured patients are showing up in hospital emergency rooms and clinics, having lost their coverage under the Affordable Care Act. Executives running some of the biggest hospital systems, including large for-profit chains spanning many states, expressed concern over the unexpectedly sharp rise in uninsured patients and the costs associated with treating them. Many executives said that the hospitals were also reporting more unpaid medical bills and providing more in the way of charity care. Some hospital systems also found that patients were foregoing or postponing lucrative elective procedures because they no longer had coverage. The rise comes after congressional Republicans ended enhanced federal subsidies. Politics: Elon Musk said that he planned to spend at least $100 million on the midterm elections to help Republicans. Elon Musk, a year after voicing deep frustration with the Republican Party and threatening to start a third party, appears to be back in the fold and prepared to spend big in the midterms to help GOP candidates. Mr. Musk, the world's richest person, has authorized his super PAC to spend $100 million to $120 million on a new field program in at least 8 states to help elect Republicans in November, according to 2 people briefed on the plans. The planned injection of cash from Musk, who spent more than $250 million on Trump's 2024 campaign, would make him one of the most consequential donors in the midterm cycle. Wisconsin, the state's former lieutenant governor abandoned his campaign for the Democratic nomination for governor. A Democratic socialist is leading in the polls. Mandela Barnes, the former lieutenant governor of Wisconsin, abandoned his campaign for the Democratic nomination for governor on Thursday, the latest jolt to a tumultuous primary that has divided the state party. His exit came as State Representative Francesca Hong, a Democratic socialist, has built a broad base of support and polled well ahead of Mr. Barnes and other more moderate candidates. In a message posted online announcing his exit, Mr. Barnes said that it has become very clear who our nominee is going to be. Wisconsin Democrats see this year as an opportunity to build power in a closely divided state. Military: hundreds of bases are contaminated with PFAS, which are linked to low birth weight and other risks. Bipartisan anger has grown at the Pentagon's delayed cleanup. In December, Representative Jack Bergman of Michigan, a staunch ally of President Trump and MAGA defender, took to the House floor to praise America's military might, then took an unexpected turn to pollution. "We have much more to do," he said. High on his list, cleaning up PFAS, the harmful forever chemicals that pollute hundreds of military sites nationwide. The Pentagon must prioritize delivering environmental stewardship to communities impacted by PFAS. In a fiercely divided Washington, there is bipartisan consensus on little else, but lawmakers from both parties are demanding explanations for the Pentagon's slow progress. Sports: FIFA announced plans to sell stakes in the World Cup to private investors. European nations agreed to boycott the tournament. European nations have agreed to boycott the World Cup over FIFA's plans to sell stakes in the tournament to private investors. The decision to boycott any competition run by FIFA was taken at a virtual meeting of the 55 national associations which are members of UEFA, the European Football Confederation, on Thursday. That followed news of FIFA's proposal on Tuesday, with World Football's governing body telling its 211 member associations that the plan needed to be approved by September 19. UEFA later confirmed its stance, saying it and its members unanimously and categorically opposed the proposal. Ebola, the outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo is already the second worst on record and is spreading much faster than previous outbreaks, the health ministry said. The Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo has already become the second largest on record, and it is spreading much faster than previous outbreaks, according to figures released by the World Health Organization this week. The official death toll has jumped to 1,558 people in fewer than 3 months. Put another way, the species of Ebola behind the current outbreak, Bundibugyo, has killed more than 5 times as many people as previous outbreaks did in the same amount of time, officials from the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said at a press briefing on Thursday. Georgia, a jury found that the father of a teenage school shooter bore criminal responsibility for his son's actions, sentencing him to 15 years in prison. The father of a teenager who fatally shot 4 people at his Georgia high school was sentenced on Thursday to 15 years in prison after a jury found he bore criminal responsibility for his son's deadly attack in 2024. The father, Colin Gray, had been convicted in March of murder and involuntary manslaughter, among other charges. Prosecutors argued that he shouldered significant blame for the shooting in Windery, Georgia, because he had given his son, Colt, then 14, the rifle that was used and failed to heed warning signs as the teen's mental health deteriorated. Now, time to unwind. The original Game of Thrones show ended in 2019. But Westeros, the mythical land first spun into existence by the author George R.R. Martin, has only kept expanding since then. Witness HBO's hit spin-off House of the Dragon. Now Westeros is expanding again with a stage adaptation at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. The new play, Game of Thrones, The Mad King, is in some ways a strange fit for the home of Judi Dench and Helen Mirren. But Dominic Cooke, a highly regarded director of Shakespeare, is planning an enormous and serious-minded production. It opens in August. A sword fight is like a dance, and a dance is like a sword fight, too, which is why, in a stifling rehearsal room in South London in late May, dozens of actors stood in parallel lines, pivoting, parrying, pointing and retreating as giant puppet horses watched from the sidelines. This was at a rehearsal for a dance number in an epic production that began previews after a significant delay. For Ryan Condal, the co-creator and showrunner of HBO's House of the Dragon, the creatures are key to the show's magic, literally and figuratively. They are the one fantasy element that we've allowed ourselves, he said. In our world, in this period, the magic is these dragons. But they are also death incarnate, all metaphor, all allegory for nuclear conflict. On a lighter note, the cheerful red packaging of Tandy Chocolate's protein nom noms will catch your eye first. Then, as you circle closer, it'll be the word protein in all caps. These candies, often marketed as healthy or functional, are taking over grocery aisles, gyms and supplement shops. If the nom noms aren't for you, maybe you'll like the Hornbill Strombles, a protein candy bar. Or perhaps the Rotten Gummy Crunchies, featuring soluble vegetable fiber and allulose, a low-calorie sweetener. Are they healthier than normal sweets? That's the question on everyone's mind. Dinner table topics. Who were the yuppies? A historian argues that we live in the world they created. In the late 1970s and 1980s, a new breed arrived in New York and other cities. Educated and ambitious, they took jobs in corporate law and finance, earning big salaries, as much of the middle class foundered. They sought out then exotic foods like sun-dried tomatoes and balsamic vinegar. They bought designer clothes and high-end electronics. They exercised. The media labeled them yuppies, short for young urban professional, and tended to characterize them as shallow and materialistic. Dylan Gottlieb, an assistant professor of history at Bentley University, spent years researching this cohort for his book Yuppies, the bankers, lawyers, joggers and gourmands who remade the American city. We live in the world we inherited from them, he says. Going through the Pacers, in Central Park, hundreds of people relived a gym test many of them loathed as kids. On a warm, cloudless July morning in Central Park, hundreds of young adults, most wearing workout clothes, fanned out into a long line and faced Jordan Haber, 25, as he hit play on a portable speaker. A monotone voice rang out, The FitnessGram Pacer test is a multi-stage aerobic capacity test that progressively gets more difficult as it continues. The 20-meter pacer test will begin in 30 seconds. Line up at the start. The pacer, which stands for Progressive Aerobic Cardiovascular Endurance Run, is a fitness assessment in which participants run between two lines that are 20 meters apart. The laps are paced by a standard beat that gets faster over time. For many, it was a childhood nightmare revisited with irony and nostalgia. Raised A's and disappearing G's, Haley Stevens' accent has dominated the Democratic Senate primary race in Michigan. Haley Stevens had heard quite enough from people who had heard quite enough of Haley Stevens. "There's those cool kids on the internet," Ms. Stevens, a four-term Michigan congresswoman, said last week, rubbing her hands together at a rally for her Democratic Senate primary campaign, bobbing in a denim jacket with the sleeves rolled up. "They're doing the cool kid chatter. That chatter, the stuff of coastal elites," she insisted, had centered on how she chatters. Some skeptics of Ms. Stevens, locally and nationally, heard the exaggerated Midwestern twang of a schlocky Saturday Night Live impersonation, with its raised A's and disappearing G's. The politics of pronunciation briefly came to dominate the Michigan Senate race. What makes us sick? More and more science shows that inflammation causes all manner of diseases and disorders. Inflammation keeps us alive, it's also making us sick. The body's defense system, designed to fight infection and heal injury, turns chronic and destructive in ways researchers are only beginning to understand. From heart disease to depression, from Alzheimer's to autoimmune conditions, the fingerprint of chronic inflammation appears again and again. What to do tonight? Cook a delightful quinoa salad with corn and basil. Watch the first episode of The Times as a little treat with Nikita Richardson. This week, she visits an artisanal Mexican bakery serving up a killer sourdough conchas. In the first episode, we visit Masa Madre in Sunnyside, Queens, where everybody loves a little treat, especially Nikita. Last year, she tasked the food team with highlighting some of the best little treats in New York City with 3 rules: no reservations required, $20 or less, and it had to bring them joy. They came up with 46 examples, though they could have easily doubled or tripled that number. New York is teeming with options, so many, in fact, that they've now made a show out of it. Get up and dance to some of these feet-moving films. From era-defining musicals to art house dramas, artists from the world of performance share their favorites. The camera loves a kinetic object, consider the titular red balloon wafting through Paris streets. But it's the dancing human form that has most reliably held our collective attention, going back to the Serpentine dance films of 1895, which render a performer's swirling dress in hand-tinted pastels. We're drawn to spectacle and talent, which can feel infectious. Get acclimated to Apple's new and improved Siri. Our consumer tech columnist recommends these 5 prompts. For the last 15 years, talking to Siri felt profoundly uncool. Though it performed a few basic tasks, like adding calendar appointments and setting timers, Siri was so subpar that asking it for help was often counterproductive. So when Apple announced in June that a profoundly more capable Siri powered by Google's artificial intelligence would arrive this year, the question was, will we finally see people talking to Siri on the train? The upgrade transformed the beleaguered virtual assistant into a modern chatbot. It's imperfect but worth trying. Play today's spelling bee, Wordle, and mini crossword. For more, find all our games here. And one last thing, bam! Emeril's back. Growing up, I knew Emeril Lagasse only by the grinning face on an old shaker of Emeril's original essence in our spice drawer. I had to ask my parents who he was, because, by the time I was old enough to ask, the Food Network had long since cancelled his shows. But a new generation of scrollers has suddenly, almost miraculously, stumbled upon him. Vintage clips of him grating potatoes and tucking garlic into beef tenderloins, with a mix of swagger, machismo and kindness, are generating millions of views on social media. I continue to just keep scratching my head, Emeril said upon learning of his second wind of stardom. It may be hard to explain to readers who grew up scrolling through influencer feeds what a superstar Mr. Lagasse was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. His cooking variety show, Emeril Live, aired 5 days a week on Food Network, which was paying him a then unprecedented $333,000 a year. He had guest stars, a house band and a live audience who would scream bam! On cue. Now, decades later, the internet has rediscovered him not as a meme, exactly, but as something more like a comfort object, a reminder of a certain kind of television that doesn't exist anymore. Have a flavorful evening. Thanks for listening. This has been the evening from the New York Times. I'm Evan Gorlick. See you tomorrow.